Hi everyone, I'm Caroline McKinnon from the Inclusive Research Collective, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth event in our Small Talks for Big Change seminars. These are a collaboration between the Perivoli Africa Research Centre and the Inclusive Research Collective, and they are a series of 6 virtual sessions where we begin to look at the layers of power imbalances between research collaborations between the global north and researchers in the African continent. These events are being recorded for colleagues who can't attend live. And if you missed the previous 3 events in these series, we will share the links to those recordings, which have closed captions available in English or French after this event. If you would like to access the closed captions for this live event, please click the CC button on your screen to enable this. And we recognise the importance of honest conversation, but as a polite notice, we expect our speakers and other attendees to be treated with respect at all times. Failure to do so will result in you being removed from the session. If you have any questions, please put these in the chat or Q&A function for afterwards. And today we very warmly welcome Professor Puleng Selago, who holds the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair in the University of South Africa as our speaker today. Professor Selago undertook a degree in psychology at City University of New York, followed by a PhD in psychology from the University of South Africa. In 2013, Professor Selago was the recipient of the UNISA Principal Prize for Excellence in Research. In 2014, was the winner of the National Science and Technology Young Women in Science Award, and was the 2021-22 regional winner of the very prestigious World Academy of Sciences for Public Understanding and Popularization of Science Award. Professor Selago is passionate about mental health and community well-being, and her work pays particular attention to the need for curbing global gender inequalities. Professor Selago, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. I know you are incredibly busy, but very briefly, I will pass over to Isabella, who will explain which layer of power imbalance we'll be discussing today.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and hello everybody, and welcome to you, Puleng. It's wonderful that you are joining us today. So I'm going to share my screen very briefly. To those of you who have watched previous talks in this series, you will be familiar with this graphic. But just to quickly explain that we think that when thinking about asymmetries, inequities, in collaborations between actors, science actors in Africa and those outside of the continent, we need to be careful to distinguish between different elements of power imbalances, in particular different layers of power imbalances as illustrated here in this heuristic. At the outer layer are imbalances in practical collaboration arrangements. This is the focus of much of equitable partnerships discussions and frameworks these days, and you will very likely have engaged in discussions around these practical collaboration arrangements in terms of the inequalities, the asymmetries within them. And the first speaker in our series spoke to those. But we are saying that these practical imbalances are underpinned by a series of underlying layers of imbalance, power imbalances, starting at the very core with imbalances at the level of epistemologies. And this is what our previous speaker, or our immediate past speaker, Divine Fu, talked to, as well as inequalities at the layer of languages, and then theories, concepts, and a related sense of extroversion, which is a gaze and orientation to the West for the production of scientific knowledge. Divine also spoke to those other 2 layers in his talk. The third layer, which very much builds on those, is the layer of the development frame and the development gaze that it imposes on collaborations. And this is the layer that Puleng will speak about today. And a final layer which we will raise in the next talk is the layer of imbalances in the resourcing and the capabilities of higher education and research institutions in the continent and those outside of the continent. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Puleng. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much, Isabella, and colleagues. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to share a few thoughts on this ongoing work that we are doing on the possibility of transformative research partnerships and what are some of the challenges linked to us not being at the space or the possibility of having transformative research partnerships. I would like to start by drawing from Chelsea Watego, her book called A Day in the Colony. Watego is a Munjanjali and South Sea Islander woman born and raised on Yugera country in Australia. Her book offers an overview on how the impact of colonialism continues to linger on the bodies and psyches of Indigenous people around the world. Her narratives resonates with some of the issues that I would like to center in my brief talk today. So I would like to highlight a few points that she raises in the book as a way to centering and starting to speak about the problematic of the developmental gaze. She says the following: I studied an undergraduate applied health sciences degree focused on Indigenous health with a predominantly Indigenous cohort of students and in varying or of varying ages. And together we learned from white lecturers how ill, how tragic, how risky and problematic our existence was. It was a genuine shock to me to learn how sick we were as a people, because at our kitchen table, I was regaled with stories about Auntie Dora, for example, who as a child was rounded up like a cattle and brought to Brisbane from her traditional country up in the Gulf region. But the story wasn't a tragic story, even though it was. The ending was that she lived to be 100 years of age, right? So the moral of the story and its function in Watego's dad telling her over and over again was to remind her and her siblings of the strength of Black people despite the violence of white people. Her dad would never say explicitly, but it was the terms of reference, and this is important, it was the terms of reference for how they came to know themselves in the place that they occupied, and it was one of living white violence rather than survival predicated upon white benevolence. So who tells the story and how the story is being told? So within the health sciences, Watego argues, we are not known as genocide survivors. We are known as living, as healthy, or as well. We are instead, so they are not known as genocide survivors, known as living or healthy or people who are well. Instead, what we find in most of the health sciences studies is that there are premature deaths that we find among Indigenous people, among Black people, via illness and ailments, the cause of which can be explained through a knowing of us, of Indigenous people, as a people who don't know what's good for them, right? And if by any chance they survive, they don't actually care about their health. And as such, often undeserving of healthcare because it's almost as if it's a waste. You take care of people who don't take care of themselves, who don't love themselves. So the kind of narrative that persists also determines what kind of response one gets, right? So what Watego does is that she challenges us to critically think about our education systems and what we mean by quality education. And here we're talking about content. So when you're talking about education, access to education, what kind of education are we talking about? What content is there, right? One of the SDGs, SDG 4, speaks about quality education, and one of the things that it highlights is the importance of access to education, but it does not go beyond this. So as long as you get access to education, that's what's important, that's what we must strive for. And we don't go deeper in engaging with what Divine was speaking about around issues of epistemologies. What kind of knowledges are there? What is it that's privileged within the education system? And so I would like to argue that access should not be the ultimate goal. It's important for us to get access to education, but it should not be the ultimate goal. As we continue to have education systems that continue to dehumanize those who are perceived to be unthinking beings. And we hear this in how Watigo tells and narrates her story. What does it mean to get access to an education that dehumanizes you? An education that erases or nullifies your history? It's therefore important to think about content of what it is that we are being taught, what we teach, what we conduct research on, what we choose as the focus of our research collaborations. All these aspects and issues are important. To engage and critique what we are teaching and seriously thinking about what epistemic justice means will allow us to rethink how we define quality education. Quality education should mean an education that allows and enables people to draw from their own histories and knowledges. Watiga's narration that I referred to earlier highlights the importance of such a critique. What we center, the language we use, the categories and how we name is very important. So understanding education as a political act is very critical. With this as a starting point, I would like to zoom in on the ways in which we engage the idea of development. In particular, I would like to share a few thoughts or some provocations around how research collaborations or research partnerships frame who sets the agenda for the research that is being conducted. We speak about the global north and the global south. We speak about developed countries and developing countries. And we know that in these categorizations and naming, there are implicit and predetermined understanding of who falls within which particular category. And as a result of this, the terms of reference around how the agenda is set when it comes to research collaborations gets determined by these categorizations. Jairo Funes Flores, who is a curriculum and teaching professor in Texas, argues that the term third world forms part of a racist and colonial discourse. It establishes a hierarchy of underdeveloped, developing, and developed peoples and regions. It naturalizes the hierarchy while hiding how domination and exploitation structures the world as such. In his critique of the idea of development, Keita also contends that the idea of development is generally seen as central to any discussion of the economic, cultural, and political sociologies of the world's nations. Nations of the West are seen as developed and members of the first world, while those of Africa, Latin America, and some of those in Asia are seen as developing and belonging to the third world. These categorizations have material currency as they determine the direction of the gaze. So I would like to raise a number of challenges that my colleagues and I have been grappling with in our critique of what we call the developmental gaze. One, part of the legacy of colonialism has meant that global North research partners control how knowledge is produced in Africa. They set up the research sites and employ research staff within these regions with limited involvement and contribution from the African partners. As a result, the research ecosystem remains untransformed. Inequitable research partnerships privilege the global North, over local audiences in the communication of research and its findings. And this is often underpinned by the almost exclusive use of Western languages such as English, French, or Portuguese, for example. So what are the implications of this in terms of how knowledge then travels? What gets lost in translation when we only limit scientific knowledge production based on these languages? And of course, African languages are always perceived as not developed enough scientifically, right? And then the second part is that one of the main concerns that the research agendas in Africa have shown to be mostly driven by the interest of collaborating research centers, rather than being driven by the needs of the communities involved. So if the agenda is set from the north, without the involvement of the communities within the locale or context wherein the intended research is going to be done, then who gets to benefit really? So it's this idea of just extracting knowledge for the benefit of the North. And that is problematic. There's almost always a predetermined script that sets out what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. The voices of those in these communities are muted, as their contributions or inputs are hardly sought. You know, when we come with a set recipe on how something is going to be done. And thirdly, the research priorities, the focus of the research, the agenda, and what counts as progress continues to be viewed from the lens of the global North framing. This puts Africa as perpetually developing. As some scholars have highlighted, Africa in this development frame is understood as developing, as I've also said earlier, as a site of deficit, as a site of lack, much like what Watigo shares about her Australian context and experience. Africa is seen as this site of lack that needs to catch up with Western modern advancement. Such a framing determines very much, if not most, research funding also in Africa. What priorities are set and who determines what is to be prioritized? It constrains the latitude for scholarship in the continent in that it delimits broader areas such as health more broadly from the basis of those who are in the context and other issues that are considered relevant for inquiry in, by, and for Africa. And with such areas, therefore, there's an imposition of particular renderings of the key problematics of desired solutions that require evidence for action and impact, typically on policy or practice. Because all this work that gets done and the research that is conducted and the findings continue then to inform the policy that we end up having in place, right? The development frame actively excludes Africa. It excludes African priority research areas because of these predetermined agendas, including in strategic future-oriented fields that are not captured or foregrounded in or aim to contest international agendas and arrangements. And as we see also in the UNESCO 2021 report, that there is a dominance in terms of health-focused research in the continent. So it's almost as if Africa is this diseased place where most of the research is focused on health. While that is important and critical, the focus of it and the setting of the agenda in terms of how such research is to be conducted is often not in with the involvement of African people themselves. So there is comparably minimal scientific work undertaken in strategically critical, including technology and engineering related fields. So this then assumes that there's no innovation or innovators within the African continent. So ICT is not often centered. Maths, physics, astronomy, these are often not centered as they should So when you think about innovation, for most, Africa is not immediately something that then comes to mind, because what innovation is happening in Africa? Again, it's around the gaze and who sets the agenda and what gets centered. So when you think about Africa, it's often about health-related research that gets centered, right? If restricting substantive areas of inquiry is one key constraint that the development frame imposes on the continent's academic endeavor, then the closing off of geographies for investigation by Africa also is another issue that we need to think about. And here Paley highlights the unidirectional research gaze from the developed global north to Africa, which sets the continent up as a place for investigation and intervention by global actors. So there's really an opportunity where the gaze is returned in bidirectional inquiry of comparable issues. Rarely is it reversed through Africa investigations and interpretations of the global north, right? And what do we lose out on, colleagues? So for colleagues in the global north, for colleagues in the UK, what do you lose out on when we do not create space for this bidirectional inquiry? What do we exclude by centering this unidirectional gaze? We also need to engage with how the restrictions for African scholars is systemic and institutionalized. For example, when you come from the UK, when you come from Europe, when you come from the US, access to the majority of African countries is relatively easy, but the reverse is not the case. We struggle to travel to these parts of the world because of visa impositions, for example, that limit and greatly police our movements. So the challenge is multi-layered and should be understood as such. At a systemic level, not only at an institutional or individual level, how the institutions are set up in a way that systematically excludes. So as I move towards closing, how can we rethink research collaborations differently, where Africa is not viewed as a place of lack and in perpetual need to be developed? And here, just a few points that I would like to leave us with. Africa, as the cradle of humankind, has long nurtured the rest of the world, specifically the UK. While the problematic nature of the extraction of resources from Africa is well documented, there still exists the opportunity for equal transformative partnerships between the so-called global north and Africa. From where we are sitting, we believe that transformative partnerships have the potential to enable free-flowing information that is not unidirectional. There are many African scholars who are making major inroads in fields such as nanotechnology, in water management, for example. And like I said earlier, these are not centered when we're thinking about what is it that gets produced in Africa, right? And again, with the restrictions, these do not become scholars that you think about often when you are based within the global north, because again, of the challenges in terms of information moving. There will be an opportunity to redress the injustices of the past and those that are persisting in the present through knowledge sharing that focuses on the development of the global scientific knowledge ecosystem that holds not only an appropriation or appreciation for Africa's resources, but its people, their histories, and their knowledges as well. And an ethic that does not see Africa as perpetually developing. I think we are beyond a point where we are asking or demanding recognition from the North, but are rather seeking for the recentering of Africa and Africa taking its rightful place in the global scientific knowledge ecosystem. It is my hope that opening up to such a shift can assist for us to reap the benefits of our collective knowledge together. And in closing, the dominance of the global north is not natural, but historical and a product of deliberate actions. The solutions, therefore, must be deliberate as well. Companies of the North own a lot of knowledge produced in the South. Think about all the huge publishing houses where we publish, after which we lose our rights to what we have produced. The companies owning publishing platforms and journals help to undermine the principle of accessible knowledge. The idea that knowledge is not some commodity to be used for profit. We have to look at and challenge the role of these capitalist endeavors in education and in knowledge production more broadly. Support for knowledge must not be a mere extension of development aid. Rather, it must be informed by horizontal dialogues and joint actions for change. And of course, there needs to be an investment in infrastructure that is necessary for the work to be able to be possible. And with this, colleague, I shall pause and thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you. That was fascinating. It gave me lots of things to think about. So is it okay if we have some questions, please, if you have time for some questions? When you spoke about Indigenous cultures essentially being nullified in our teaching, and this is something that we see quite often with regards to things like biopiracy, where, you know, obviously natural parts of the natural world that have been used for many, many years, with Indigenous cultures all of a sudden end up as chemicals in the Western world, that their names are changed, essentially the history is erased. Do you think that this perpetual motion of what we still go through now is essentially just a form of piracy? That things are essentially stolen from Africa and used in the Western world, as we say, you know, we've discovered this is what we do, and it's a form of erasure.
Definitely, I absolutely think so, because often there is again no acknowledgement, and this speaks to the broader agenda around who's got access to these resources and spaces, the ways in which the biodiversity also becomes controlled in a way that gives access and denies access to local people, but then give access to these big companies, big pharmaceuticals, that then take ownership of these plants and biodiversity and plants that people have, and then they get sold back to people, but also not acknowledging, first of all, I mean, when you look at the packets and all these many, there's never any acknowledgement, but also again acknowledgement in the sense of saying, you know, this comes from that place, but also acknowledgement in terms of profit sharing, because it's always about profit, and that continues to be the issue. And this is again part of the bigger agenda of just extracting and then turning things into something else, and then taking ownership of that without acknowledging. So it is, I would definitely agree that it is a form of piracy in many ways. We just changed the name, but it's actually something that was taken from elsewhere that people were using, sometimes in its raw form. And then there's also these restrictions that are set on people to say, but it hasn't been scientifically proven and checked its safety and all of that, and use that as a reason to deny people access and use of natural plants for their well-being, definitely.
Yeah, and it is worrying the fact that, you know, things like rapamycin, which is commonly used over here in experiments, you know, throughout, well, globally, and yet our students didn't know the background of rapamycin. And when they look into it, they say, well, hang on, why weren't we told about this? And I think what's encouraging now is that students want to know the truth. They want to have a much more balanced and well-rounded education, and they want to know the origins of different chemicals or methods or thinking. I'm heartened by that, but I think there's still a very, very long way to go.
Yeah. No,
Um,
definitely, Caroline. I think if I can maybe just add a little bit on that, because I think it's part of the broader agenda of the project that we're working on, that when we're thinking about reimagining the global scientific knowledge ecosystem, and when we think about how transformative collaborations or partnership or knowledge production, or even how we think about the content in the education system, that this is something that has often not been centered in terms of what is it that students are being taught, how far back in the history, in them understanding that which they are being taught, the context of it, the historical understanding of it is also very important, because by not doing that, then you are erasing a lot in terms of the genesis of much of what we are sharing in the classroom or in the research that we're doing.
And we're doing our students a disservice if we're not preparing our students to be global citizens, which is what we want to do as a university. But if we're not doing that, then we're failing our students by ignoring all of these other aspects. So thank you. We have a follow-on from this as well. So that was a wonderful talk. Thank you. As you've just said, it is always about profit. Everything comes back to money in the end. So how do you envisage these transformative partnerships can be funded?
And obviously for the project to be able to succeed, there has to be, as I said at the end of my talk, there has to be resources that are put in place. There has to be infrastructure, thinking about the work that needs to be done. And if we are recentering, is there an opportunity and support for that work to happen? So, and we see this as something that requires a multi-layered understanding and a multi-layered support or stakeholders coming in. So we're looking at various funders from both the global north and the global south. We know that there's already funders that are in place that are funding research broadly, but also that have made a specific effort to ensure that they want to support research that centers equitable partnerships and collaborations from different regions. And so with this charter, we're actually saying we need to take that further, that if we're talking about this kind of work and this kind of research, we also need to be very strategic in terms of how funding happens as well. So we're actually challenging funders, saying, when you do fund projects, we would like you to be very specific and conscious in terms of what kind of projects that you are funding. And we're basing this on the different layers that we spoke about, and say, if you take this on, then this contributes to how your funding can actually contribute towards ensuring that we are moving towards transformative partnerships, where there is a rebalancing in terms of who is centered and who is not centered. So we are also thinking about the importance of partnering with governments, because that's also very important. So we understand that the support of the government is important, and not just for policy, but also in terms of ensuring that the infrastructure is in place and the resources are in place. One of the things that keeps coming up that's related to this question is, how do we do this work in places where there are no resources and support? And that's why it's so critical for us to ensure that from the onset, we get the buy-in and support of the different governmental structures. So that forms part of the stakeholder engagement. So we are eyeing and have already started being in conversation with strategic partners such as our parliamentarians, and we're also looking into Africa strategically in that sense as well, for the different countries within the African continent, because we realize that without the buy-in and support, the project itself will likely not be successful. So we're looking at it from a multidimensional level in that sense.
Yes, and it certainly is. I think the more you look into it, the more layers you can find as well, can't you? So we heard in a previous talk about things that UKRI are doing. And as you mentioned in your talk today, a lot of what's happening at the moment with regards to these partnerships focus on health research. So I think there should be obviously, and this is part of the charter, I can imagine, a massive drive for funding bodies for physics, maths, and all those other disciplines as well, to get more on board with this. I know the UKRI isn't perfect, because obviously we've heard in previous talks about how people are still contacting researchers in Africa with preformed ideas and grants that are already written. So hopefully this charter will stop that and will have truly equitable partnerships from the outset as well. I wanted to maybe add another layer, not that it needs more layers, but I wondered if you would like to briefly talk about gender inequalities as well. So I know that's quite a large topic. However, there's lots of data that shows that many of the research grants go to men. And when you think about that as another aspect of an inequality as well, is that something that the Charter at some point will try and tap into as well? Or is that something that's way into the future because there's all the other layers to try and tackle first?
I think within the layers that we speak about, when you delve deep into it, some of these issues manifest themselves in that, right? I agree with you fully that gender is very, very important as a central issue around who produces knowledge, who is highly cited, and who gets funding. The numbers are there, and we know that the majority of those who get funded continue to be men, and women do not get as much funding. But then again, it is a structural issue also, right? That many of these institutions, the ways in which they're structured, they are structured in a way that does not attend to gendered understanding of being and existence. And we know when institutions, universities were developed, that it was again with the understanding that women are going to be staying at home and attending to children. So even when we start speaking about gender equality and opening up spaces for women, the spaces themselves, the systems themselves, the universities themselves, the structures do not change in a way that also takes into consideration the multi-faceted role that women also play, right? Or have to attend to. So if you're going to go on a writing retreat, or if you have to attend a conference in the UK, and you also have children that you need to take care of, and you want to take your children with, but the conference does not accommodate for children, or if you want to go for an exchange program, or if you have a joint program with colleagues from a different place, can you be in the lab for a long time, or can you go and visit your colleague for 3 months so that you work on a project? And the ways in which, again, the resources are set up, they are set up in a way that does not take that into consideration. There has been some move, I think very, very few progressive funders or supporters that when one applies for funding, they also take that into consideration, so that your other responsibilities are not perceived as a hindrance, or your other responsibilities lead you to not applying for that huge grant, because you know that you're not going to be able to meet what they require. So at the end of the day, it's going to look negative for you, because after 3 years, you've been working on this project and you did not complete it because you had all these other issues. So for some, they choose not to apply for promotion, to be at decision-making, levels within the institution, or they don't apply for funding because they know the implications in terms of responsibilities that come with funding. So again, this is at that layer of ensuring that the infrastructure itself takes into consideration issues of gender. The resources that are available take into consideration issues of gender. And so they are set up in such a way that does not exclude on the basis of gender.
That sounds great. Thank you. We've got some more questions that have come in as well. So reversing the development gaze and setting of global agendas are crucial to reimagining and recognizing priorities within the continent. How far can we go in ensuring that this gaze is reversed, given that these agendas are set by institutions probably outside the remits of academia, i.e. the UN, WB or IMF?
Yeah, that is a fair and important point. And that's why we also deem it very important to also be strategic in who we approach when we're thinking about who do we think is critical in partnering and buying in on this project, because definitely these institutions set the agenda. And if we are not in conversation with these institutions, we will be talking to ourselves. And the fundamental changes that we're hoping to achieve will not happen if we only speak to ourselves and don't engage with these institutions. So as it is already, as part of the stakeholders and the stakeholder meetings, we are having the UN on board. And I think for us, that's a good starting point. And they have shown interest and support in terms of what this charter aims to achieve. Because we understand that definitely we speak about the SDGs, all of these things, and understanding that how we define and how we see them manifesting in our spaces, it has to manifest in a way that ensures that the gaze is not unidirectional, right? So I made an example of SDG 4 that speaks about access to education. So when we're in conversation with the UN, you can say, but when we're talking about access to education, it's important that we think beyond just access. And what would that mean? That would mean we also need to think about what kind of education is available, or what kind of education are we prioritizing? The first layer of epistemic, in what way is our education contributing towards epistemic justice and epistemic fairness in terms of what gets taught? So children can get access to education. But if that education tells me that my people are savage, my people don't have history, that's education. That's what I'm learning at school. But how is that education contributing towards building me as a citizen, building me as a future leader in thinking about the development and progress of my context and my location? So that's why it's very, very critical that the buy-in of these stakeholders have to be at the center. We already started, and we're hoping that we will get more buy-in as we continue with engagements and consultations with the different role players. And as I said, we already have the UN as well. So yeah, work in progress.
Thank you. And I think the last question, because of time. So thank you for the interesting presentation. It's almost as if Africa plays a passive role in this power imbalance, and it is largely upon the global North partners to redirect and redress things. If that is the case, isn't it defeatist in some ways?
Africa is playing a passive role in this power imbalance. I think the conversation that we're having today speaks to the opposite. I think the conversation that we're having today and the initiative to say we need to recenter and shift the gaze speaks to not being passive. And I think it's also very important to understand how, again, we spoke about the colonial legacies, we spoke about the power imbalances where the agenda has always been set by the global North, and how that has always imposed what happens in Africa and how things need to happen within the African continent. And I think some of the conversations that have been taking place, ours is not a new one. I think we're adding to that, we're building to that. And an initiative such as this speaks to this, to shifting from the passive role, because there is this understanding that if there are no resources and no support, what can we do? We'll take money from where it comes from, but what do you lose at the same time? So having these dialogues and conversation aims at shifting and changing that narrative of Africa as being passive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the charter coming out of so many different institutions in Africa as well is
within the continent
is incredibly important. Sorry, there's one last question that's just come in. Thinking about the African lens, does the charter link to Agenda 2063?
We do acknowledge and also engage Agenda 2063. I think like the many other agendas that are in place, it's important obviously to check what is there and what are the plans in terms of what the continent, but also more globally, what is it that we want to achieve in the next coming years, moving towards 2063. So as we do this work and as we study what's in place, what exists, we do that with these in mind, and we look at how what we're doing, how we are thinking, also speaks to the agendas that are already in place, not only to align ourselves with them, but also to challenge them, right? So it's important that we do that, because I think it would be a defeatist project or agenda if we do not take all of these into consideration and work outside of these agendas that have been put in place, including Agenda 2063. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Puleng, I just want to say again, a massive thank you for coming along today and talking to us. It's been incredibly insightful and very, very interesting. For attendees, the Eventbrite link for our 5th talk is now in the chat, so please do go to Eventbrite and book on to our 5th session. We're kind of whipping through all these events now, and there's also links in the chat to the previous talks as well. If you could please just spend 1 or 2 minutes to answer our very short questionnaire, which we will send around to all attendees as well, that would really help us in planning future events to discuss these power imbalances and how to build equitable partnerships between the global north and researchers in Africa. Thank you very much attending. Thank you very much, Puleng, again. I know you're so busy. We very, very much appreciate you coming along today. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you, colleagues. Bye.